All right, fellas, so we're just going to finish up 5.2. That was the congruent polygon section that we started on the 13th of January. Okay, so most of you got to this point, but a few classes stopped. So we're going to pick up here with congruent polygons. So remember, we said that polygons are congruent, right? If they have matching or corresponding, as we say, congruent sides and corresponding congruent angles, okay? So if you see in example 2 up the top, right, you've got two triangles, and we wrote a congruent statement, right? Triangle dog is congruent to triangle cat. And remember, the matching number of arcs tells you which angles are congruent, and the matching number of slashes tells you which sides are congruent. And we did that for triangles, but obviously the section is called polygons, so we could do it for many other things as well, right? So if I wanted to look at this example 3, and maybe I just want to try and figure out which angles are congruent to what and which sides are congruent to what, maybe I'll start with the angles, right? And like I said, some of you already did this in class, so that's okay. But again, I'm going to say angle U is congruent to angle M, right? They both have one arc. Angle V is congruent to angle A. Angle W is congruent to angle T. And angle X is congruent to angle H, right? So 1 arc, 2 arcs, 3 arcs, 4 arcs. So those are the congruent angles. And then if I wanted to list the congruent sides, right, I would just match up the number of slashes. So WV is congruent to AT, right? They both have 1 slash each. XW congruent to TH, 2 slashes each. Number 3, UV congruent to AM, 3 slashes each. And lastly, XU is congruent to MH, 4 slashes each, okay? So I'm just writing out the congruent sides and the congruent angles. So the slashes and arcs give you a lot of details, okay? And in the future, we're going to use those coming up in the next section especially. All right, so if we wanted to write a congruent statement for something that's not a triangle, you could just say the word polygon. So notice if I start with angle U, that has 1 arc, and then I go to the angle with 2 arcs, 3 arcs, and 4 arcs, right? And polygon UVWX, okay? That's congruent to, if I start over in the polygon on the right, 1 arc, 2 arc, 3 arc, 4 arc, the order would be MATH, okay? So notice how U always has to match up with M, V has to always match up with A, and so on, okay? So, you know, they're like a pair, can't separate them. So, basically what we call this is one simple phrase. So if corresponding sides of congruent triangles are congruent, right? So you have, you know, 1 slash, 1 slash, 2 slash, 2 slash, 3 slash, and 3 slashes, right? Same with the corresponding angles, right? If you have 1 arc and 1 arc, 2 arcs and 2 arcs, 3 arcs and 3 arcs, right? Those angles will be congruent. So the simple way to put this is CPCTC, corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, okay? And you know, you might see that if you look it up online. But that's just a way to say what we've been saying the whole time in this section, is that, you know, matching sides are congruent and matching angles are congruent. And they substitute corresponding for matching. So same idea though. All right, and we already wrote some congruent statements for these guys. So, all right, so now we want to look at what if, Mr. Enzi, they don't have any slashes or arcs, and they just tell us the congruent statement. what can I do, or how can I find out which parts of the triangles are the same? Okay, so the congruent statement does tell you which angles are congruent and which sides are congruent. Okay, so if we look at this next set of triangles, notice there are no slashes, there are no arcs. So, but they do give us a statement here. So that statement is going to tell you everything you need to know. So as long as you have that statement, you do not need any slashes or arcs, because that statement tells you where the slashes and arcs should go. So if we look down here, so I made a table just like we did in class yesterday. And so notice, let's start with the angles, right? I think that's the easiest one to pick off. So triangle WVU is congruent to triangle GHI, right? That's the congruence statement right there. So since W is the first letter in the first triangle and G is the first letter of the second triangle, then we know that angle W is congruent to angle G. Since angle V is the second letter of the triangle and angle H is the second letter of the triangle, right? In this congruence statement right here, in this statement, not on the triangles, but in that statement. So since V and H are both the second letter, angle V is congruent to angle H. And since U and I are both the last letter, angle U is congruent to angle I. So basically just match up letter for letter, okay? The first letter of the first triangle, the first letter of the second triangle, right? And so on, and that'll tell you which angles are congruent, okay? Now, what's a little bit different is the sides. So again, we can use the congruence statement for the sides. So again, there's going to be three sides of the triangle, okay? So we need three pairs of two letters. So again, the first two letters are WV and GH. So line segment WV right there is congruent to line segment GH. Now, what if we did the second two letters? VU and HI, right? So line segment VU is congruent to line segment HI. And then we have the first letter and the last letter, first letter and the last letter. WU is congruent to GI. So first two letters, last two letters, and the first and the last letter. So that'll tell you what sides are congruent, okay? And if we really want, you can mark up the W and the G, the V and the H, and the U and the I. So notice now we added our own markings, but you don't have to add your own markings. That's why we have the congruent statement, okay? Okay. All right, here's another example. So again, I use this statement right here. Triangle TUV is congruent to triangle GFE. So I know angle T is congruent to angle G because those are the first two letters, or the first letter of each triangle. Angle U is congruent to angle F. Second letter of each triangle. Angle V is congruent to angle E, the third letter of each triangle. Okay. Then TU, first two letters of the first triangle, congruent to GF, first two letters of the second triangle. UV, last two letters of the first triangle, congruent to FE, last two letters of the second triangle. And then TV, first and last letter of the first triangle, congruent to GE, first and last letter of the second triangle. All right. So that's basically it. So now what can we do with this? So we can use this to solve problems, right? So usually we'll be given a congruence statement and they're going to ask us to find different values, right? So I'm given triangle ABC is congruent to triangle WYX. Now you need to be careful. Just because these are oriented the same way does not mean, oh look, A and W are the same, B and X are the same, Y and C are the same. You can't just look at it and say that. Unless there are slashes and arcs, then you could. But notice up here, angle A and Y, B and W, and C and X are the same. So it's sort of like they were flipped over, okay? So, the second triangle was sort of like flipped. It's not in the same orientation. So my first goal is to find R. So R is right here. R is at angle Y. So what I do is I go and say, well, angle Y is the first letter. So angle Y is congruent to angle A, and A is 65 degrees. So R has to be 65, okay? So N is in YX, right? N is the measure of YX. YX matches up with AC. So N would be 10. Because AC is the first and last letter of the first triangle. Y and X are the first and last letter of the second triangle. All right, now for S. S again is at angle W. Angle W matches up with angle B. So S is 55. All right, so see if you can find D. See if you can figure out what that is. Okay. And those are the answers. All right, so example 6 works the same way, right? So you've got quadrilateral, find the value of the variables if quadrilateral ABCD is congruent to quadrilateral YZWX. Okay, so again, right, these letters are gonna tell you, what matches up with what. So ABCD, right, and maybe you wanna write it underneath YZWX. So, for example, maybe I'll start off with the angles. So if I want to find, it's asking me to find everything here. So like find R, right? R is angle X is congruent to angle D, so R is 71, right? Notice how I wrote them on top of each other so I know which angles match up with what. Okay, so N is at angle W. Angle W is congruent to angle C. So angle C is 90. So N is also 90 degrees. So again, S is at angle Z. Angle Z is congruent to angle B. So since B is 112, Z is 112. And S is also 112, since that is the measure of angle Z. And then lastly, find T. T is at angle Y. Angle Y matches up with angle A. Angle A is 87, so T is 87. Okay, so notice I'm just matching up the angles and then figuring out what numbers are what. Okay, now obviously the sides are going to be a little bit harder, but no worries. So find M. M is at WZ. WZ matches up with BC. So BC is 4, so WZ is 4. So M has to be 4. So H is at WX. WX matches up with CD, right? CD is 15. WX is H, so H equals 15. Okay? So finding J. J is at XY. So XY is the first and last letter. So XY matches up with AD or DA, doesn't matter. So J has to be 10. And last but not least, I'll let you try and figure out what K is. So K is YZ. YZ matches up with AB. AB is 12, so YZ is 12. And thus K is 12. So you just want to go through, match them up, and then fill in the value, okay? All right, and all the answers are there. You know, and here are some other problems for you that you can look at. Okay. But a basic summary is this, right? If you have two polygons congruent, the corresponding sides are congruent, and the corresponding angles are congruent, okay? The slashes and arcs will tell you what you need to know, but if there are no slashes and arcs, remember they'll give you a congruence statement. You break down the congruence statement, and then you figure out what angles and which sides match up, okay? All right, so that'll end this. If you have any questions, please reach out to me on Friday, okay, before the next class, okay? So if you have a question, just reach out, okay? And, you know, be specific about your questions, right? Don't say, I don't get it. Tell me what you don't get, right? So I can help you with something specific, okay? Because I'm not sure, you know, is it the whole thing? Is it half the thing? You know what I mean? So be clear about what you're struggling with, and then we can look over it from there, okay? All right, so have a